He was the absolute master of Valdor, a nobleman entombed within his own castle of ice, accustomed to silence and obedience. She was merely the new governess, armed only with a gentle sweetness and a quiet audacity that refused to bow before the storm. Two opposing forces, isolated by the Transylvanian winter, operating on the verge of a touch neither dared to admit, yet both desperately desired. Who will break first when pride clashes with restrained passion? If you allow yourself to be seduced by ancient mysteries and great twists, subscribe to the channel now so you do not miss a single chapter of this journey. And if your heart desires to experience even deeper and more unforgettable romances, visit our Patreon page. There, exclusive, intense, and complete stories await to be devoured in the dim light. The link is just below, in the pinned comment. Now stay with me until the end of this story, where aristocratic pride is the front line and restrained desire is the imminent ruin. The coachman insisted on seeing omens of death in the accumulation of the November snow. Emilia Voss ignored the theatrical warnings, preferring the frigid silence of the cabin to the superstitious chatter of that man. With the tips of her gloved fingers, she wiped a circle on the fogged window, letting the vastness of the black pines and the mist-veiled cliffs envelop her. The snow fell with an ancestral indifference, covering the slopes of Transylvania as if wishing to erase beneath a mantle of absolute oblivion any trace of human passage. She did not fear the winter. She carried in her suitcase the urgent need for a fresh start, and in her breast a gentle resilience that prevented her from turning back. Valdor emerged like a stone scar carved into the mountain. It was a village of severe, proud, and Gothic architecture, where the damp cobblestone streets gleamed under the pale, flickering light of kerosene lanterns. The church, steeples narrow and austere, pointed toward the heavy sky like dark daggers, seeming to offer prayers out of pure automatism, devoid of any warmth. Emilia stepped down from the carriage even before the wheels had completely stopped turning, her dark woolen skirt brushing against the cold stones. The coachman accepted her departure with an audible sigh of relief. He clearly had not the slightest intention of climbing a single meter higher toward the peaks inhabited by the Dragomirs. In the village's covered market, the thick air smelled of wood smoke, tallow, and stale bread. Emilia approached a cast-iron brazier, seeking warmth for her stiffened fingers, while maintaining a polite and attentive distance from two local women who conversed in alarmed whispers. "They say the Count has banished his own rest," murmured the elder, adjusting a rustic woolen shawl over her shoulders. "He walks the corridors in the dead hours, as if hunting for something that crumbled between his hands." "Or someone," the other completed, her voice fading into the emptiness of her wicker basket. "That man's grief is a disease consuming the very foundations of that place. Whoever enters there forgets the sound of laughter." The silence that followed was heavy, weighed down by the reverent dread that the name of the dynasty provoked. Emilia absorbed the anxiety of others, but her expression remained impenetrable, her grey eyes reflecting only the dying embers of the brazier. She purchased a slice of dark bread and headed to the information desk, inquiring firmly about the transport sent by Castle Dragomir. The carriage awaiting her was tucked away in the gloom of an alley. The footman who led her was little more than a boy, his ears battered by the cold, and his lips sealed by a mute, rigorous dread. During the tortuous 40-minute ascent, Emilia kept her eyes fixed on the silhouette materializing against the leaden firmament. The castle did not reveal itself all at once. It emerged in fragments of an architectural nightmare, first the outline of a watchtower, then the imposing silhouette of a parapet, and finally, the colossal mass of dark stone rising above the perpetual white mantle of the mountain. The high, narrow windows reflected the light of the lanterns, with the glassy coldness of a gaze that had long ceased to welcome visitors. It was a fortress designed to repel the world. The main door, reinforced with wrought iron, groaned mournfully, even before Emilia could lift the knocker to announce her presence. The man who received her exuded an almost theatrical, aristocratic rigidity, his spine so straight he seemed on the verge of snapping under the weight of his own fabrics. With impeccably aligned white hair and severe attire, he subjected her to a clinical and silent scrutiny, assessing everything from the worn leather of her traveling boots to the brim of her modest hat. "You are remarkably younger than we anticipated for the position," he observed, his voice dry and devoid of any courtesy. sounding like ancient parchment being handled. Emilia was not intimidated. She began to remove her gloves, sliding the fabric from each finger with a deliberate slowness, keeping her chin subtly raised. "And you demonstrate considerably less hospitality than the job advertisement promised," she retorted, her voice gentle yet perfectly sharp. She tucked the gloves into her coat pocket, sustaining the man's gaze with unwavering serenity. "However, I believe our acquaintance will be perfectly functional, provided efficiency is maintained." There was a flash in his eyes, a spark of surprise and involuntary respect upon encountering a haughty resistance where he expected only the blind obedience of a frightened employee. The man stepped back, yielding passage with an almost imperceptible inclination of his head. "I am Ilie Petrescu, the butler of the house." He paused, weighing the impact of her words before concluding, "Please enter, Miss Voss." The interior of the castle exuded the scent of beeswax, centuries-old wood, dark tobacco, and an underlying aroma that Emilia took a moment to identify. The smell of a grief that had become part of the structure itself, like pressed flowers in a book no one dared to open for centuries. Ilie guided her through the immense halls without uttering a word. The dark tapestries, depicting medieval hunts and forgotten dynasties, absorbed the light of the rare candles lit, turning the environment into a patchwork of light and mystery. Emilia, out of pure survival habit and practical intelligence, counted her steps mentally and mapped the exits, memorizing the geography of that stone labyrinth. In the third corridor, where the pointed arch ceiling made the space even more cavernous, a sudden and inexplicable chill ran up her spine, halting her steps. The atmosphere had changed. It had become thick, charged with an invisible electricity. At the end of the hall, where the shadows became absolute, a man stood motionless. He was extraordinarily tall, with broad and imposing shoulders, dressed in a black coat so deep it seemed to merge into the very darkness of the castle. He offered no greeting, nor did he move a muscle. He merely observed her from afar with a predatory and magnetic intensity, calculating the impact of that new presence in his domain. The light from a side sconce revealed only the pale, frigid blue of his pupils, fixed upon her like those of a hawk. Emilia held her ground. The contrast was absolute. She, a figure of gentle sweetness and stability. He, the personification of the storm and isolation. She refused to lower her eyes or show the weakness he seemed to anticipate. The voice that finally broke the silence was low, raspy, and marked by an exhaustion that seemed to come from centuries of insomnia and tortuous thoughts. It echoed through the stone walls, vibrating directly in Emilia's chest. "The pass road was blocked by frost at exactly 1800 hours, Miss Voss." Emilia kept her shoulders aligned, refusing to back down before the obvious attempt at intimidation. Her response came with a crystalline calmness. "I was informed of the blockage in the village, my lord." "And yet my timepiece reads precisely 2000 hours, Lucien countered, his pale blue eyes fixing upon her like blades. He tilted his face, his brow furrowed in disapproval. An ordinary coachman would have turned back. Prudence dictates that one does not challenge the Transylvanian winter for a whim of punctuality. "Punctuality is not a whim. It is an obligation of my position," Emilia countered, sustaining the Count's gaze with a respectful yet perfectly sharp audacity. "My carriage proved to be more persistent than the weather, and I do not usually allow the snow to decide my appointments." Lucien stopped short. A subtle tension rippled through the muscles of his back beneath the black coat, the hairs on the nape of his neck reacting to that unexpected insolence veiled by good manners. No governess, indeed, almost no one in the entire province, had ever dared to answer him with such haughtiness. There was a fleeting flash in his dilated pupils, an almost imperceptible glimpse of admiration that he hastened to suffocate immediately with his facade of ice. "A dangerously obstinate line of thought," he observed, his voice dropping to an almost velvety yet still cutting tone. He uncrossed his arms, taking another step forward, his aristocratic presence looming over her. "I have read the flawless and vast recommendations sent to me regarding you. The bureaucrats in Bucharest spent a great deal of ink, praising your rectitude, your implacable efficiency, and your docility." He paused deliberately, measuring the impact of his words, before delivering the dryly ironic conclusion. "I see the praise for your efficiency was fair. As for the rest, the reports failed miserably." Emilia took a subtle step toward him, closing the distance and demonstrating that the Count's dark magnetism would not make her retreat. An almost invisible smile played at the corners of her lips. "Reports are meant to describe the work, my lord, not to predict the temperament of the person performing it. If you were seeking a woman who bows before a storm, or a grim reception, I fear you have indeed received the wrong candidate. However, I assure you that the castle will be in order under my management." The silent clash that followed made the air between them seem scarce. Lucien stared at her for another eternal second, processing the audacity of that seemingly delicate woman who, dressed with simplicity and marked by the exhaustion of the journey, maintained her sovereignty before him. "We shall see, Miss Voss," he cut in, his frigid voice raining once more as he turned his back. "We shall see if your competence survives the reality of Valdor. Ely will show you to your quarters. Good night." Lucien sustained her gaze for another eternal second, a glimpse of the spark that, months later, would set that house on fire. With a fluid and dark movement, the Count spun on his heels and vanished into the darkness of the east corridor, leaving only the echo of his footsteps. But in the silence that settled, Emilia felt that the air between them had changed definitively, becoming dangerously scarce, dense, and irremediably linked. The winter in Valdor had just met its first rival. The light of a cloudy morning in Transylvania brought no warmth, only a grey clarity that crudely exposed the wounds of Castle Dragomir. Through the high window of her new quarters, Emilia observed the severe contours of the east wing, where a few blackened beams stood out among the frost-covered tiles. The scent of old ash and dampness seemed imbued in the very light that cut through the valleys. Two short, firm knocks on the door interrupted her thoughts. Ilie Petrescu awaited her in the corridor. The butler wore an impeccable woolen frock coat that exuded the sharp aroma of dried lavender, and a flat iron, an absolute contrast to the Gothic decadence surrounding him. In his outstretched hands rested a sheet of heavy-gauge paper, folded in 3 parts. "The directives for your stay, Miss Voss," Ely announced, his tone of voice devoid of any friendly inflection, as befitted a servant of his lineage. "Drafted by milord's own hand." Emilia accepted the paper. Her fingers brushed the rough texture of the linen. Lucien Dragomir's handwriting was angular, imposing, with final strokes that cut firmly into the paper. She read in silence. The requirements were clear and restrictive: the prohibition of moving through the east wing, the mandatory curfew in the servants' quarters by midnight, the interdiction of any questioning regarding the past of the house, and above all, the express order never to alter the arrangement of the volumes in the library. She folded the document slowly, holding it between her fingers. "Any questions?" Ely inquired, his perceptive eyes fixed upon her, attempting to decipher her reaction. "Several, Mr. Petrescu," Emilia replied, sustaining his gaze with a calmness that seemed to discomfort the old servant. "But I imagine it is not with you that I should discuss them." The butler contracted his lips, a subtle gesture of acknowledgement before indicating the way to the stairs. The first dinner at the E. Castle, however, altered the course of those orders even before the first night ended. The dining room was a vast, barrel-vaulted gallery, warmed by an immense fireplace that roared against the cold outside, yet did little to dissipate the heavy atmosphere emanating from the table. Emilia expected to receive her meals in the servants' quarters, as customs dictated for a governess. To Ely's confused surprise, and Emilia's own, the table had been set for 2, seated at opposite ends of a dark oak surface that could accommodate 20 guests. They shared the space in a thick silence. Lucien was dressed in a black velvet coat, his high-collared shirt covering the base of his neck. Under the flickering light of the candles from the silver candelabra, his light blue eyes looked like fragments of ice. He barely touched the roasted venison with wild mushrooms on his plate. Instead, his long fingers slowly rotated the crystal glass, making the red wine swirl against the glass walls. Attracted and secretly disturbed by the audacity she had displayed in the foyer, the Count observed her. He wanted to keep her close, to test her fibre, to understand what kind of woman did not bow her head to the master of Valdor. Determined to break that coldness, Emilia set her utensils down upon the porcelain with a soft click. "The covered portraits in the south corridor," she began, her voice low and warm, cutting through the stillness of the hall. "Are they all of the family?" The movement of Lucien's fingers around the glass ceased instantly. The silence that followed was so thick that the crackling of the wood seemed deafening. He raised his eyes slowly. There was something dangerous in that immobility. "They were," Lucien finally replied, his voice raspy, cutting like the winter outside. "Some are turned toward the wall." "I noticed," Emilia continued, tilting her head slightly, her grey gaze catching his without hesitation. "It seemed to me that perhaps the arrangement could be more suitable for those who inhabit the house today. The castle would gain more life." "Miss Voss," his tone did not rise, but it carried the weight of an absolutist order. "You received a list of directives this morning." "I did," she replied, allowing a subtle trace of dry humor to show on her lips. "However, it is curiously silent regarding questions about the decoration of the corridors, and it also did not justify why I am dining here with you." Lucien leaned slightly forward, resting his forearms on the table, breaking the formal distance. His gaze descended to her well-shaped mouth before focusing back on her eyes. "Consider this a last-minute addition to your directives, Miss Voss," he declared, his voice dropping to a thicker, more measured tone. "Your presence at this table every night becomes a requirement of mine. I do not tolerate dining alone with my thoughts, and your audacity has proven to be a suitable pastime for the winter. You will dine with me. It is an order." Ely, who was serving the wine in the background, stopped short for a brief second, his eyebrows rising in restrained astonishment before he recovered his rigid posture. Inviting a governess to share the master's table was an absurd breach of protocol, a clear sign that Emilia was already affecting the master of Valdor in unforeseen ways. Emilia leaned back in her high-backed chair, assimilating the imposition. Far from being intimidated, she accepted the hidden challenge in those pale eyes. "If it is milord's wish, so it shall be," she replied softly, sustaining the pale gaze that watched her from the other end. "But know that I am a terrible listener for silent monologues. If you want me at your table, you will have to tolerate my questions." Lucien did not answer immediately. His long fingers gripped the silver handle of the utensil with such force that the knuckles of his hand turned pale under the candlelight. He knew that she knew the limits imposed in that morning's directives, and the audacity of that deliberate affront made the blood run faster in his veins. The Count's gaze descended, almost involuntarily, down the lines of Emilia's face. There was an attractive delicacy in the symmetry of her features, a soft beauty that seemed to bloom precisely under the hostile atmosphere of that hall. The subtle warmth rising from her cheeks, provoked by the defiance, contrasted with the sobriety of her attire and awakened in him an attention that went far beyond mere irritation. Emilia, for her part, felt the weight of that attention reverberate in her chest. Under the gloom of the candelabra, Lucien revealed himself to be a man of undeniable presence. Even with a dark and seemingly unshakable expression, the outline of his firm jaw and the contrast of his light eyes against his dark hair carried a magnetism that prevented her from looking away. He was handsome in a dangerous and melancholy way, like Transylvania itself at the beginning of winter. They remained occupied with the meal for about 5 minutes. The silence that settled between the two became thick, filled by an invisible current that shortened the meters of oak separating them, while the utensils clinked softly. Breaking the trance, Lucien pushed his chair back. The sound of the heavy wood scraping against the stone floor echoed through the high ceiling of the hall. He stood to his full height, adjusting his dark velvet coat with a sharp gesture. That woman moved through his spaces and through his thoughts with a naturalness that annoyed and fascinated him in equal measure. "Dinner ends at 9, he declared, his voice dropping to a lower tone, looking down at her across the table while the shadows cast by the flames drew severe contours on his face. "Understood," Emilia said, remaining seated, feeling the warmth of his gaze still alive on her skin. "But you have eaten almost nothing, milord. You should take better care of yourself." Lucien hesitated for a full heartbeat, the surprise from such a personal and direct observation tensing the muscles of his shoulders. No one had dared to care for him in years. Turning toward the exit, his steps echoed firmly on the stone floor, breaking the spell of that moment. "Good night, Miss Voss. Good night, Count." He crossed the threshold of the hall, but Emilia noticed, through the eye reflection on the polished wood panels of the wall, that he halted his steps in the dark corridor for a prolonged moment. There, standing in the gloom, Lucien seemed to search for control over his own reactions before finally beginning his ascent of the stairs. The silence that returned to the room no longer brought the solitude of before. It was populated by the certainty that Lucien Dragomir's ice had found a deep. The routine at Castle Dragomir possessed a cadence of its own, governed by the ticking of ancient clocks and the echo of footsteps on stone corridors. Emilia Voss had assumed her duties without fanfare. Within a few days, she had organized the inventory of the rooms, begun supervising the servants with serenity, and reviewed the overdue quarterly accounts with the dexterity of one who had learned early on that precision was her only armor. It was during one of these afternoons of inspection that she pushed open the heavy oak doors at the end of the west corridor and discovered the library. The space was immense, warmed by the lingering scent of aged paper, leather, and charcoal. Imposing shelves rose to the vaulted ceiling, flanked by dark wood rolling ladders. Emilia walked slowly among the stacks, letting her fingertips brush the worn spines. As she pulled out a small volume of poetry bound in crimson velvet, a loose leaf caught her attention. In the margins of the pages, inscriptions in faded ink revealed a feminine handwriting, small and formed with intense strokes. The notes contested the verses with an almost palpable vivacity. It was certainly not the harsh script of Lucien Dragomir. Later, while cataloguing supplies in the pantry near the rear of the house, a sound from the outer courtyard interrupted her work. Through the slit of the narrow window, Emilia observed the tall silhouette of the Count. He wore only a shirt and dark trousers, with heavy boots, indifferent to the cold wind. Before him, 3 vigorous hounds wagged their tails near the gate. Lucien knelt in the mist, distributing pieces of meat with unexpected patience. "Slowly, Radu," he murmured, his raspy voice losing its usual harshness as he stroked the larger animal's ear. "There is enough for you as well, Corbu. Be calm." Emilia took a step back into the shadows of the pantry, keeping that image with her. The man who spoke to the dogs by name seemed to carry a humanity that the village rumors sought to erase. At night, sleep eluded her. The Transylvanian cold seemed to penetrate the thick stone walls of her quarters, and Emilia's mind insisted on replaying the mysteries surrounding that house. Wrapping a grey woolen shawl over her shoulders, she descended the spiral staircases carrying a single candle, its flame dancing timidly against the draughts. She sought the silent comfort of books, but upon pushing the heavy oak door of the library, she realized the room was already occupied. The fireplace was lit, casting long liquid shadows across the shelf-lined walls. Lucien was settled in a worn leather armchair, a book open on his knees, and a glass of untouched cognac on the side table. He did not move his head immediately, but the subtle shift in his posture revealed he had noted the intrusion. The two stared at each other for a few seconds through the golden gloom, like souls caught in a secret lapse that neither knew how to name. "You seem to find difficulty in sleeping or inhabiting your own silence," he observed, his voice raspy and low, keeping his eyes fixed on the pages before him, though his attention was entirely turned toward her light footsteps. "The winter of this castle is a restless host, my lord," Emilia replied with a gentle sweetness, walking toward the side table to set her candle beside his. The proximity allowed her to notice the persistent furrow between his brows. "And I see I am not the only one to prefer vigil over rest." Lucien raised his eyes slowly. Under the flickering light of the fire, the Count's features lost part of their aristocratic rigidity, bathed in a warmth that softened his severe lines. "There is a subtle difference, Miss Voss," he countered, his pale eyes fixing upon her with an intensity that made Emilia's pulse falter. "This is my castle. I have the right to wander through my own shadows." Emilia tilted her head slightly, allowing an almost invisible and perfectly audacious smile to emerge at the corners of her lips as she reached out to touch the spine of an ancient volume. "And books are my domain in this house, Count. If the shadows brought you here, I fear you have invaded my territory by right of office." His usual harshness gave way, replaced by a flash of curiosity he could not camouflage in time. Lucien leaned back in the armchair, closing the book on his knees with deliberate slowness, without looking away from her. The magnetism between them narrowed the space of the room, transforming the vast library into an intimate refuge. "A curious line of defense for a governess," he murmured, his voice dropping to an almost confidential tone devoid of real severity. "Do you intend to evict me from my own library, Miss Voss?" "I would never commit such heresy, my lord," she replied, her voice soft as the brushing of pages. "But since we share the same exile from sleep, I believe we can share the fire. Lucien made no move to send her away. He merely indicated the upholstered chair a few feet away with a subtle nod of his head. Emilia sat down, smoothing her skirts. The heat from the fireplace began to dissipate the cold in her fingers, but it was the contained and imposing presence of the man before her that kept her senses fully awake. After a few minutes of a stillness pregnant with unspoken words, Emilia allowed herself to break the silence. She opened the small crimson velvet book she had brought with her from the afternoon cataloguing, its pages exuding an ancient perfume. I found this volume in the section of Oriental poetry, she began, holding the book open between her hands, her fingers tracing the contours of the writing in the margin. The notes here are very precise. Whoever inhabited these lines disagreed vehemently with the author. Lucien flinched imperceptibly, his gaze fixed on the object in Emilia's hands, with a fixation bordering on pain, but also her vulnerability he never showed in the light of day. She disagreed with almost everything, he declared. The she floated in the heated space between them, heavy, lyrical and cold as a promise of a storm, revealing to Emilia that behind the Count's armor there was a labyrinth she was increasingly determined to decipher. Emilia ran her thumb lightly along the edge of the yellowed pages, keeping her tone of voice deliberately calm and firm. The proximity and isolation of the night sharpened her natural audacity. Was she good at it? She asked, sustaining his scrutiny, her grey eyes flashing with a hint of cutting provocation. Or did you simply find it irritating to be contested within your own walls? Lucien closed his own book firmly, though his movements remained controlled. He spun the signet ring on his finger, a habit Emilia was beginning to associate with his silent anguish. Deep within the Count, however, the insolence of that governess produced a dangerous effect. His thoughts clashed between anger at seeing her invade his memories and a sudden primitive desire rising up his spine. That rosy, attractive mouth uttered words far too bold for a subordinate. Lucien felt the dominant masculine tension burn through his veins, a silent internal struggle between the urge to order her out of his presence immediately and the overwhelming impulse to stand, close the distance between the chairs, seize her by the shoulders, and silence. That insolence with a devastating kiss, showing her with the force of his possession who truly ruled that castle. She was good at many things, he replied, his voice falling to a raspy whisper, tired and dangerously lower, trying to contain his own demons. And it took me a long time to realize all of them. Not that it is any of your business, Miss Voss. Your function is to look after the order of the house, not to dissect my regrets. Emilia did not retreat before the warning. Ante. The contrary, the glimpse of that man full of shadows struggling against his own memories and against the evident attraction emanating from him exerted an irresistible fascination over her. She pulled the book against her chest, but remained where she was, sustaining the light blue gaze that seemed to devour her in the gloom. The castle keeps difficult memories, my lord, Emilia said, her voice dropping to an almost confidential tone, challenging his authority with a softness bordering on sin. But some of them deserve to be read, not just locked away. Do you fear the ghosts, or what they reveal about your own isolation? Lucien tilted his head by a millimeter, his jaw so clenched that the scar on his neck pulled slightly. The magnetism between the two stretched to the limit, an invisible line threatening to snap at any moment. His eyes dropped to her lips, and the need to dominate that audacity became almost uncontrollable. He wanted to silence her, to tear away her pose of the perfect governess and see what was hidden beneath the grey woolen shawl. There is a very thin line between curiosity and danger, Miss Voss. I advise you to remember that some memories burn those who try to touch them, and I assure you that I do not have the patience of my hounds for dealing with intrusions. I handle heat well, Count, she replied, standing up slowly, holding the book with trembling fingertips, though her posture remained haughty. And as far as I know, the fire in this hearth has not consumed me yet. Good night. She walked toward the exit, feeling his gaze burn her back with a physical intensity until she crossed the threshold. Lucien remained in the armchair, his breathing heavy, the cognac forgotten, entirely tormented by the internal struggle that had nearly made him break decorum. In the dark corridor, Emilia leaned her back against the stone wall, her racing heart pulsing violently in her veins. She placed her hand to her chest, surprised and secretly frightened to notice that Lucien's dark side and dangerous masculinity attracted her in a way she had never experienced before. For her own sake, it was better to stay away from him. The midday silverware gleamed under the dull light that managed to overcome the stained glass windows of the dining room. The room, usually governed by a sepulchral quiet, had been invaded by the massive presence of Father Octavian Mureșan, the parish priest of Valdor. Occupied his chair with the authority of someone who did not ask permission to exist. His thick, greying beard rested upon his dark cassock, and his eyes, endowed with an almost uncomfortable vivacity, moved between the Count and the new governess with a silent shrewdness. Lucien kept his long fingers extended over the table, his posture rigid like that of someone counting the minutes until the end of that intrusion. I hear that the new governess reorganized the quarters. Accounts in just 2 days, Octavian commented, before raising his goblet of red wine. His tone carried that sharp irony of one who knows the dark corners of the human soul. Lucien did not even move his torso, but his jawline visibly hardened. "I hear you hear too much for a man of God," the Count retorted, his husky voice falling like a cold blade upon the table. Octavian let out a short, deep laugh that echoed through the wooden beams of the high ceiling. "God gave me 2 ears and 1 mouth, Lucien. The proportion is purely suggestive." Seated to the left, Emilia kept her eyes fixed on the porcelain of her plate, lowering her face millimetrically to hide the outline of a smile that insisted on drawing itself upon her lips. It was a subtle gesture, but it did not escape Lucien. The Count shifted his gaze from the priest to focus on the delicate curve of Emilia's neck, where a rebellious strand of her brown hair had escaped her practical bun. There was an uncomfortable magnetism in that silent insolence of hers. She did not tremble before his ill humor, nor did she seek his approval. The brutal self-control he exercised over himself seemed to find in her a mirror of equal strength, coated in sweetness and mystery. Octavian observed the invisible exchange of glances, the dense subtext that tensioned the air between the two, and smiled behind his beard. "Miss Voss possesses efficient methods, Count," the clergyman insisted, leaning forward a little. "Valdor is a village accustomed to ruins and stagnation, but it seems the castle has found a mind that understands the mechanics of time. Miss Voss was hired to manage what remains of this estate, Father, not to revolutionize it," Lucien declared, and his blue eyes flashed with a coldness intended to close the matter. "Certain places only remain standing because something in them refuses to stop pulsing, my lord," Emilia intervened, her low, measured and warm voice changing the vibration of the room. She raised her grey eyes, sustaining the Count's gaze with a disconcerting serenity. "Sometimes, sorting out the accounts is just a way to ensure that the foundations withstand the winter." Lucien closed his left hand over the table, his signet ring pressing into the wood. The growing desire to touch her, to decipher her, mixed with an almost animal need to keep her at a distance, for the proximity of that woman was beginning to threaten the hermetic silence he had cultivated for years. In the afternoon, the promise of winter was fulfilled in mist. A thick, grey mass rose from the cliffs, swallowing the black pines and covering the outer garden with a damp mantle that reduced the world to fragments. Emilia was walking through the stone courtyard, the freezing air against her cheeks, when she spotted Lucien's slender silhouette. He was standing, without a coat or gloves, his white linen shirt contrasting with the darkness of the scenery. Before him rose a twisted rosebush whose dry branches, covered in thorns, looked like talons extended against nothingness. It was dead, devoid of leaves or any sign of sap. Emilia's steps were silent, but his back tensed even before she stopped at his side. His scent, dark tobacco, pine, and the biting cold of the snow, enveloped her instantly, awakening a sharp awareness of his physical presence. "I can ask André to remove it next week," she suggested, keeping her eyes on the plant. The space would be useful for planting herbs in the spring. "No." His word was a short blow, devoid of any aristocratic politeness. "It has been dead for at least 2 winters, Lord Count." "I know how long it has been dead," he fired back, turning his face toward her. The coldness in his features was so abrupt and cutting that the air between them seemed to freeze. His blue eyes, once pale, displayed an almost desperate ferocity. "Leave it where it is." Emilia did. Not back down. Instead, she slowly extended her hand. Without the protection of gloves, her pale fingers approached one of the thorny branches. Lucien caught his breath, his gaze fixed on her movement. Before her skin could touch the sharp point, his fingers moved with surprising speed, wrapping around Emilia's wrist. The touch was electric. His hand was freezing from the winter, but the warmth emanating from her wrist accelerated beneath the Count's long fingers. Lucien maintained, his grip for seconds too long, feeling the rapid pulse. The fragility of her bone structure combined with that gentle audacity that disturbed him deeply. The proximity allowed him to see the small strands of hair that the wind blew against Emilia's forehead, and the simple aroma of dried lavender that emanated from her seemed to invade his senses, obliterating the smell of ancient smoke from the castle. "Some things," Lucien murmured, his voice lower and raspier than usual, his jaw clenched as his eyes descended to her delicate mouth, "are kept standing only to remind us of the price of certain mistakes. Do not touch what you cannot save." Emilia sustained the grip, refusing to pull her arm away. She tilted her head slightly, looking at the rosebush and then directly into the depths of his eyes. In that instant, without a single word about Isolde being spoken, she understood that that plant was not a plant. It was a monument to his own willful ruin. "You cling to the thorns because you fear forgetting the pain, my lord," she said, perilously soft, "but forgetting is not the same as healing." Lucien released her wrist abruptly, as if he had been burned. He stepped back, his hands closing into fists at his sides, visibly struggling to regain the brutal control that defined him. Without saying anything more, he turned his back and disappeared into the dense mist rising from the valley. Late in the afternoon, Father Octavian's carriage was waiting before the main gates of the castle. The footman held the reins firmly, while the clergyman adjusted his heavy cloak before departing. Ilie Petrescu watched from the threshold with his usual rigidity, but stepped inside to fetch the visitor's hat. Emilia remained under the stone archway of the entrance, her hands hidden beneath her grey shawl, still feeling the phantom warmth of Lucien's grip on her wrist. Octavian stopped beside her. The man of God assessed her with a long look, stripped of judgment, but filled with a seriousness that made Emilia's heart waver. "Be careful, my daughter," he said, his deep voice mixing with the sound of the wind that was beginning to howl through the towers. Emilia blinked, striving to maintain the straight and impenetrable posture she had cultivated for survival. "With the Count?" she asked in a whisper. "With the castle," Octavian corrected, and his immense hand rested for a second on her shoulder with a fatherly gentleness. "The Count is merely the most visible man it haunts." The priest climbed into the carriage without looking back, leaving Emilia alone before the immensity of dark stone. Behind her, in the shadows of the foyer, she knew by the rising of the hairs on her arms that Lucien was watching her from the darkness of the stairs. A few days later, dust floated in the west wing like fragments of suspended time. That sector of the castle, though free of formal prohibitions, was avoided by the servants, making it the perfect refuge for the silence Emilia sought. As she walked, the aroma of lavender from her own clothes mixed with the acrid smell of old wood and dampness that emanated from the walls. Upon pushing open a double door whose hinges protested in a low creak, she found the music room. The room was circular, dominated by arched windows that looked out over the misty cliffs. In the center rested a grand piano, buried under a faded beige tarp. Emilia approached with steps muffled by the worn carpet. Her hands, accustomed to physical labor and free of adornments, gripped the edge of the fabric and pulled it firmly. The tarp slid off with a heavy whisper, revealing perfectly preserved rosewood. She sat on the upholstered bench. She lifted the fullboard and slid her fingers across the ivory keys, feeling the cold of the material against her fingertips. She pressed a chord. The sound reverberated, deep and slightly melancholy, defying the stagnation of the air. Emilia closed her eyes and began to play. She did not seek sheet music or the virtuosity of concert halls. She sought only the memory of her mother's hands, a Romanian woman passionate about music who had taught her that this art form was the only way to say what the mouth needed to keep silent. It was a simple melody, stripped of ornaments, but executed with a measured and warm cadence that seemed to extract an almost physical weight from each key. Absorbed in the rhythm, she did not hear the footsteps in the hallway, nor did she notice when the imposing silhouette of Lucien Dragomir occupied the doorway. The Count remained there for a long time, motionless, his broad shoulders leaning against the dark portal. His blue eyes, usually cold, fixed on the curved line of Emilia's back, descending along the shape of her neck to the hands that moved delicately over the ivory. The aroma of tobacco and cedar that he carried began to disperse through the hall, but Emilia only became aware of his presence when the last note fell silent, leaving the room immersed in a vibrant quietude. She opened her eyes and turned her head slowly. Neither of them spoke immediately. The scene operated entirely in silence, and the magnetism that seemed to shorten the physical distance between them. Lucien observed her with an intensity that made the air seem scarce. When he finally broke the stillness, his voice sounded different, husky from an ancient fatigue, stripped of the harsh authority with which he usually shielded himself. "Isolde used to play Chopin," he said from where he stood, pronouncing his late wife's name without the usual startle. "What you played was not Chopin." Emilia closed the piano lid slowly, the sound of the wood serving as punctuation for the space between them. "It was my mother." She sustained the Count's pale gaze, refusing to lower her head. She had no technique, but she played as if every note cost something. Lucien took a step forward, entering the hall. The movement caused the pale light from the window to outline the thin scar near his throat, partially hidden by his collar. He looked at the piano for a moment, his hands hidden in the pockets of his dark coat. "What is it called?" he asked in a low voice. "It has no name," Emilia replied, feeling the magnetism of his proximity tension her muscles in a delicious and dangerous way. "It was just hers, something she liked to play while my sister and I sat on the carpet to listen to her. It was a magical moment for us." Lucien clenched his jaw for a second, his eyes fixed on her lips before regaining his hermetic posture. "Are you and your sister very close?" "Oh yes, I miss her very much. She lives in Berlin in the company of her invaluable and inseparable Lord Amber. She has fragile health." "Lord Amber? Is she married?" Emilia let out an amused laugh. "Oh no, nothing like that. Let's just say Lord Amber is a faithful friend who keeps her constant company." The Count did not seem to understand the dynamic very well, but chose to say nothing. Taking a deep breath, he merely said, "Play again tomorrow, Miss Voss," he ordered, his voice falling like a harsh whisper. Before she could formulate a response, he spun on his heels and abandoned the hall, leaving behind only the echo of his footsteps and the aroma of winter. Later, in the dim light of his private study, Lucien held a sheet of paper under the weak light of a single candle. It was a letter sent from Berlin by Sabina Voss, Emilia's younger sister. He had intercepted it by accident at the mail table, opening it before realizing who the sender was, but the content had held him within those lines written with a biting vivacity. Ili Petrescu entered the room, bringing a tray with black tea and cognac. The old butler moved with his usual efficiency, but his sharp eyes noticed the document in the Count's hands. "Her sister writes well," Lucien commented, breaking the silence without anyone having asked for his opinion. Ili raised a discreet eyebrow, positioning the crystal glass upon the rosewood table. "I read only what was necessary to verify that it was not official correspondence," the Count justified, his tone of voice lacking much conviction as he looked away. "Of course, sir," Ilia replied, his polite voice disguising a dry amusement. "She does not need to know." "Evidently, sir." Lucien drummed his long fingers on the arm of the armchair, his signet ring gleaming under the flickering flame. There was a specific passage that had made his chest tighten. Sabina had written that Emilia writes about the castle as if it were a living creature, and about the Count as if he were the heart she has not yet decided whether she wants to touch. "Ili," Lucien called before the servant could reach the door. "Did Miss Voss say anything about me?" Butler stopped, straightening the spine he considered his greatest personal achievement. "It is not my place to repeat confidences, sir," Ili excused himself, maintaining a neutral expression. "Ili?" The Count's tone was a low, drawn-out warning. The old servant sighed discreetly, turning to the master he had raised since boyhood. "She said that you look like a man trying to remember how to breathe, sir." Lucien did not answer. He lowered his eyes to Sabina's elegant handwriting, his jaw so rigid that the muscles of his face stood out. He dismissed the butler with a minimalist nod and remained motionless in the darkness for a prolonged time, feeling that, somehow, the two sisters had begun to dismantle the walls he had spent years building. He would deliver the letter the following morning, with sincere apologies for having broken the seal before realizing it was not a correspondence addressed to him. The blizzard that had descended upon the valley of Valdor had already lasted for 3 days, burying the paths under an opaque white mantle and confining the few inhabitants of Dragomir Castle to a forced coexistence. The outside world seemed to have ceased to exist, reduced to the sound of the wind lashing against the high windows and the constant crackling of wood in the fireplaces. In the library, the air was thick with the smoke of peat, old paper, and the subtle aroma of Lucien's cognac. The space had become a silent battlefield, where the two protagonists shared the hours in an unavoidable proximity, disguised under the pretext of reading and inventories. The author romanticizes brutality, calling it a historical necessity, Emilia commented, her low, firm voice cutting through the quiet of the room as she turned the page of a medieval chronicle about the Eastern principalities. She kept her eyes fixed on the printed lines, but her attention was entirely focused on the man sitting in the opposite armchair. Lucien, who was inspecting an old topographical map, raised his gaze slowly. The weak light from the silver candelabra outlined the aristocratic angles of his face, lending him an almost sculptural severity. Sometimes brutality and necessity are the same thing, Miss Voss. Sometimes they are. Emilia finally raised her attentive eyes, sustaining his scrutiny with a serenity tempered by a subtle touch of irony. But the author is not being honest about which of the two he is describing, and literary falsehood is the most cowardly form of vanity. Lucien closed the map with a sharp snap, leaning back in the leather chair. There was a dangerous and, at the same time, intrigued gleam in his pupils. Her resistance to his harsh temperament operated as a constant friction that, far from pushing him away, exerted an uncomfortable magnetism upon his senses, leaving him dazed. "You have very firm opinions for someone who arrived just a few weeks ago," he observed, his husky voice dragging across the space between the armchairs. "And you have very vague answers for someone who has lived here for years." The silence that settled afterward did not carry the rigidity of the early days. It was a stillness pregnant with subtext, almost perilously amusing, where dry sarcasm served as armor for an attraction that both refused to name. Lucien tilted his head minimally, his eyes descending for a brief second to the contour of Emilia's lips before returning to the map. The veiled sensuality of that exchange resided in what remained unsaid, in the precise awareness of the rhythm of each other's breathing. On the afternoon of the second day, the atmosphere shifted. The confinement and the sudden drop in temperature seemed to have taken their toll on the Count. Emilia was crossing the notorious East Gallery, carrying a stack of maintenance reports she had gathered from Eli's office, when an unusual sound made her stop. It was a stifled, raspy noise, coming from the dimness near the broken stained glass windows that André had not yet managed to fix due to the blizzard. She approached with quick, silent steps. Lucien was leaning against the damp stone wall, with one hand pressed against his chest and the other dug into the frame of a disused door. His broad shoulders rose and fell in violent spasms, his dark linen shirt clinging to his back from the sweat of the fever. He fought for air with a desperate intensity, his face pale, and his jawline clenched to the limit. Noticing her approach, he attempted to raise his chin, gathering the wreckage of his usual arrogance to rebuff her. "Go away," he hissed, his voice failing brutally, stripped of any real substance. "No." Emilia dropped the papers on a side table and took the final step, invading his personal space without any hesitation. "It is not a request, Miss Voss," he insisted, his blue eyes flashing in a mixture of wounded pride and physical panic, as he tried to push her away with his free arm. "I know." She disregarded his resistance with a gentle firmness. Her hands, surprisingly warm against the freezing air of the hallway, rested on Lucien's rigid shoulders. The physical contact sent a rush of heat through the thin fabric of his shirt. "Breathe through your nose, slowly." "I know how to breathe," he growled, though his body contradicted him by tensing beneath her touch. "Then do it." The distance between them shortened until it nearly disappeared. Emilia felt the strong aroma of fever mixed with the tobacco and cedar that emanated from his skin. She maintained the pressure on his shoulders, subtly forcing him to anchor himself in her stability. Outside the castle walls, the howling of the storm seemed to punctuate the battle taking place in that dark corridor. Gradually, the proximity of the governess began to take effect. The chaotic rhythm of Lucien's chest began to subside, mimicking the measured, firm cadence that Emilia purposely maintained. In his eagerness to expand his lungs, The Count's trembling fingers gripped the fabric of her coat, pulling her millimetrically closer, until he could rest his forehead for a fraction of a second against the curve of Emilia's shoulder. It was in this movement of retreat that the collar of his dark shirt shifted aside. Under the dull light of the storm, the scar revealed itself in its full extent. It was a thick, misshapen mark that began at the base of his ear and descended aggressively until it disappeared beneath his collarbone. It was not the result of a clean fencing duel. It bore the irregular and cruel shape of a wound caused by brutal violence or shrapnel. Emilia did not draw back. She did not avert her gaze, nor did she ask the predictable question that anyone else in her place would. Her fingers merely rose from his shoulders to the nape of his neck, lightly brushing the dark strands of his damp hair, a gesture of raw intimacy that made the Count catch his breath. "It must have been very lonely," she said, her voice dropping to a low whisper, stripped of cheap pity but laden with a cutting understanding. Not the scar. What came after it? Lucien closed his eyes abruptly, like someone receiving an exact blow to the most vulnerable spot of his armor, an impact he had expected for years, and that, even so, ached with the force of a new blade. His body collapsed against hers, losing its defensive rigidity for the first time since Emilia had crossed the gates of Valdor. His hand, still dug into her coat, clenched the fabric with an almost desperate strength, turning that dark corridor into the epicenter of a silent surrender that would irrevocably change the dynamic between the governess and the master of the castle. The heat emanating from Lucien's body crossed the layers of fabric, but the subtle tremor that shook him betrayed the severity of the fever. Emilia remained with her arms firm around him, refusing to let him plummet under the weight of his own wounded pride. "You need to go to your quarters, Lucien," she murmured near his ear, the break in formality serving as a necessary balm in the darkness of the corridor. "There is no dignity in collapsing on this damp stone floor. Let me take you." He let out a rush of warm air against her neck, a harsh, weak laugh that denoted his agonizing resistance. "I am the master of this house, Miss Voss," he stammered, his blue eyes clouded by the mist of illness trying to focus on hers. "I do not take orders from—" "You are burning up and can barely stand," she interrupted him, her voice gentle but endowed with an unyielding authority that seemed to disarm the remainder of his defenses. "I insist because it is my duty to look after this place, and that includes the man who stubbornly insists on governing it alone. Let us go." Lucien yielded subtly, reluctantly, the weight of his broad shoulders leaning more heavily against her. After a brief period of reluctance, where the conflict between his dominant nature and the fragility of the moment operated in silence, he capitulated. Call Ely," he whispered, his voice almost entirely devoid of air, his gaze fixed on her mouth with a rustic glimpse of possession and defeat. Emilia did not need to raise her voice. The butler's swift steps were already echoing through the gallery, drawn by the presentiment of duty. Ely Petrescu emerged from the dimness, his usual rigidity slightly shaken by the scene. At Emilia's firm command, he stepped forward, offering his strong arm to support the Count. Together, the governess and the old servant guided Lucien through the sombre corridors to the master wing, where the doors of the Count's quarters opened to receive him. While Ely settled Lucien into the immense rosewood four-poster bed, Emilia spun on her heels and stationed herself before the maids who were waiting for orders in the hallway, trembling from the severity of the storm and the master's temper. "Prepare a hot bath for Milord immediately," Emilia ordered, her clear voice spreading with precision. "I want clean towels, a pitcher of fresh water, and bring a tea of strong herbs to dispel the fever. Move." Half an hour later, the steam from the bath still floated discreetly through the immense bedroom when Emilia pushed the door open. Lucien had been bathed with Ely's help and now reposed between the dark linen sheets, wearing only a clean, loose shirt, his black hair still damp and clinging to his forehead. The butler had withdrawn to arrange for more firewood, leaving the room immersed in a sepulchral quiet, broken only by the crackling of the wood knots in the fireplace. Emilia approached without making a sound. The magnetism of the room was almost palpable, the smell of pine mixed with the damp heat of the environment. She brought with her the porcelain basin with cool water and the mug of steaming tea. Sitting on the edge of the mattress, she felt the gentle dip of the upholstery discreetly draw Lucien's body toward her. He opened his heavy eyelids, the blue of his pupils fixing on her with a raw intensity, stripped of any social shielding. The sensuality of that moment resided in the contrast between his helplessness and her delicate firmness. "Drink," she requested, passing her arm behind his neck to help him. Raise himself slightly. The proximity allowed her to feel the feverish heat radiating from his chest, his breath touching her cheeks. Lucien obeyed, his lips touching the rim of the mug, while his eyes never left Emilia's face, capturing the way the firelight drew golden contours upon her skin. It was a dangerous intimacy, built on silence and necessary touch. After setting the mug down, Emilia dipped a linen towel into the cool water, wrung it out with measured movements, and placed it with extreme delicacy over the Count's broad forehead. Lucien let out a deep sigh, the knuckles of his fingers relaxing against the sheet as the cold mitigated the internal fire. His eyes closed for an instant, but his hand rose slowly, his long, warm fingers wrapping around Emilia's wrist with a firmness that possessed the weight of a silent and unbearable surrender. He did not pull her, but he held her there, bound to his tempo, making it evident that, even in the weakness of the fever, the bond between the governess and the master of the castle had become definitive. Early that afternoon, a few days later, the carriage that crossed the gates of Castle Dragomir did not carry the somber weight of the mist, but rather a vibrant insolence that Transylvania rarely witnessed. The vehicle was upholstered in Bordeaux leather, and from it leapt Lucien Dragomir, enveloping the stone courtyard in an aura of urban vivacity that seemed to mock the sobriety of the Gothic walls. Ilie Petrescu, stationed by the entrance steps with his habitual rigidity, merely bowed his head, his lips pulled into a crease that denoted a weary familiarity. Emilia Voss observed the reception from the height of the first landing of the main staircase. She held a leather folder containing the kitchen expense updates, but her attention fixed upon the newcomer. Matej wore an excellent wool overcoat, cut according to the latest Budapest fashions, and his brown hair was slightly disheveled by the valley wind. As he entered the great hall, his footsteps echoed festively, interrupting the almost religious silence that Lucien so fiercely defended. The Count emerged from the shadows of the south corridor, hands tucked into the pockets of his dark coat, his features set in a line of pure warning. "My God!" Matej exclaimed, stopping abruptly upon spotting Emilia descending the final steps. He addressed Lucien, though his bright brown eyes remained fixed on the housekeeper. "Did you hire a governess or a problem?" "Matej." Lucien's tone was a dry warning, nearly a suppressed growl. "It is a compliment, cousin." Matej stepped forward with a graceful fluidity, breaking any protocol of distance. He took Emilia's hand between his own and bowed, depositing a kiss upon her fingers with all the theatricality that Lucien never allowed himself to exercise. Matej Dragomir, the tolerable relative. Emilia sustained the gesture with surprising lightness, allowing the corners of her mouth to curve in a humorous response. She did not withdraw her hand immediately, knowing perfectly well that every second of that greeting was being weighed and measured by the man standing behind her. "Emilia Voss," she replied, her grey eyes sparking with a sharp amusement. "The problematic governess." Behind them, the metallic sound of a clasp broke the short pause. Lucien approached the rosewood table, where a crystal carafe rested, and picked up the wine glass with an accurate and unnecessary precision, his knuckles turning white under the force of his grip. It took only 40 minutes of company in the drawing room for Matej's keen nose to decipher the electric atmosphere of the castle. Seated at the tea table, the cousin enjoyed the buttery biscuits Emilia had provided, spinning anecdotes about Lucien's youth with deliberate irreverence. He used to spend entire nights locked in the stable if one of the horses had a cold, Matej recounted, leaning toward Emilia, his confidential tone igniting the magnetism of the room. He pretended it was merely zeal for the property, but he would cry hidden behind the stalls if the animal did not look better by dawn. Emilia let out a genuine laugh, a clear and warm sound that seemed to reverberate in an unprecedented way against the vaulted ceiling. "It does not surprise me," she commented, crossing her fingers over her lap, her gaze sliding sideways toward the Count. "There is a very specific stubbornness in Milord when it comes to keeping dying things under his watch." Lucien, seated in the farthest armchair, raised his glass and downed the thick red wine with a contained force, swallowing the liquid as if purifying his throat of an offense. His heavy eyelids moved slowly, capturing the way the afternoon light touched Emilia's profile, making the skin of her neck appear almost translucent. Jealousy did not manifest in him as an outburst, but as a cold poison, a brutal contraction at the base of his stomach upon seeing her smile at another man in such a free, disarmed manner. Mattei caught the glimpse. A subtle, complicit smile formed on the cousin's lips as he leaned back against the upholstery, immensely satisfied with the friction he had provoked. By nightfall, Mattei's presence had retreated to the guest wing, but the agitation he had brought remained floating in the air like thick smoke, unable to settle. Her thoughts, Emilia retired to the library. She was leafing through a volume of old correspondence, sitting near the lamp, when Lucien's long shadow projected across the yellowed pages. He had approached without making a sound, stopping at a distance far too small to be considered casual or courteous. The scent of pine and dark tobacco that accompanied him seemed to close around her like a siege. "My cousin has a habit of appearing harmless," Lucien declared, breaking the silence. Without any preamble, his husky, low voice vibrating in the darkened room, Emilia did not lift her eyes from the page, though the rhythm of her pulse had quickened beneath the fabric of her dress. She ran her thumb along the edge of the paper with a calculated slowness. "I noticed that you have a habit of appearing as the opposite," she countered, her dry sarcasm tempering her words with a dangerous sweetness. "Which of the two is more honest?" A long pause dragged between them, filled only by the dying crackle of the wood in the fireplace. The magnetism was thick, a line stretched to the limit between two bodies that demanded more of each other than the decency of the era permitted. "Neither," he admitted, his voice falling to a rough whisper, stripped of any aristocratic shielding. Emilia finally closed the book with a dull thud and raised her face, meeting him head-on. The proximity was such that she could distinguish the pale blue of his dilated pupils under the candlelight, the violent tension that shaped his broad shoulders. The sensuality of that confrontation lay in the imminence of touch, in the subtext of a possession that neither had granted, but which already operated upon the skin. "Then perhaps you should stop warning me about him," she suggested, her voice dropping to an almost confidential tone, her lips parted by short breaths, "and start telling me what you really want to say." Lucien froze. The line of his jaw tightened so much that the scar on his neck pulled slightly beneath his disarrayed collar. He fixed his eyes on her mouth, desire mingling with that dull anger of one who finds himself vulnerable, exposed by the words of a governess who knew no fear. When he spoke again, the arrogance had evaporated completely, leaving only an authentic hoarseness, raw and terribly true. "I do not know if I can." Emilia felt a shiver run down her spine, but she did not retreat a single millimeter. She raised her hand slowly, leaving her fingers suspended a breath away from his shirt cuff, offering a kindness that possessed the weight of a mutual and unbearable surrender. "I know," she replied, her grey gaze locking his in the shadows, "but I think you know exactly what you want to say." The emotional impulse that closed the night left them suspended in that shared space, where the subsequent silence carried the certainty that the rules of the house had been irrevocably destroyed. Brief pause in our story to extend an exclusive invitation to you. Are you already familiar with our private lounge at My Passion Diaries on Patreon? Imagine a luxurious sanctuary where the shadows of protocol dissolve and stories gain an incomparable intensity. We have created a varied catalogue tailored to enchant you, filled with period romances featuring arrogant nobles who lose control, forbidden attractions that defy all rules, and overwhelming contemporary passions that dominate. The senses. Allow yourself to go a step beyond what YouTube is permitted to show. The access link is right below in the description of this video. Enter My Passion Diaries and let yourself be surprised by what we have reserved for you in the shadows. The east wing of the castle was a desert of white linen and stagnant dust. Emilia entered through the heavy oak door, left ajar by a servant's carelessness, feeling the air chill instantly. There, time did not pass. It merely rotted. Massive furniture was covered by sheets that looked like ghosts crouching in the gloom, and the portraits, as Lucien had mentioned, were turned to the wall, hiding faces that the castle refused to forget. Upon approaching the cold hearth, Emilia noticed something beneath the grey ashes. Fragments of yellowed paper partially consumed by the fire rested at the bottom of the marble. She did not touch them, but the handwriting was unmistakable, the same small, intense and feminine, script that had contested poets in the margins of the library books. Lucien's she had left her last traces there before turning into smoke. Emilia's introspection was interrupted that afternoon by the arrival of Nadia Valeanu. If Matei's presence had been a gale of vivacity, Nadia's was a silent frost. She stepped down from the carriage with an austere elegance, her dark eyes carrying the kind of appraisal that is born not of anger, but of a painful recognition, as Isolde's former. Lady-in-waiting, she bore the weight of a mourning that time had not dared to touch. Lucien, stationed in the foyer, stood motionless in a way Emilia had never seen. It was not his usual defensive rigidity, but the immobility of a man trying not to bleed in public, as if the mere sight of Nadia reopened poorly stitched sutures in his soul. Her arrival had been abrupt, devoid of any prior justification. Taking a step forward, the Count broke the silence with a frigid authority, his hands tucked behind his back as he sustained the newcomer's scrutiny. "It is an unusual surprise to find you at my gates without warning, Nadia." His voice echoed through the stone foyer, laden with a formality intended to maintain the proper social distance. "I do not recall authorizing your coming, much less receiving any correspondence that would justify such a journey." Nadia sustained his gaze, performing a curtsy that possessed the precision of years of service, yet contained a dignity that challenged his position. "I ask pardon for the lack of protocol, my lord." Her voice was soft, but every word seemed to carry the echo of a presence Lucien was trying to erase. However, the weight of memories became unbearable in the valley. "I felt I needed to return to this castle, to account to the longing I still hold for my lady and friend." The direct mention of Isolde caused Lucien's jawline to tighten instantly, a visible sign of the discomfort that proximity caused him. The reception hall, however, did not remain under that suffocating tension for long. Lucien Dragomir emerged from the dimness of the adjacent corridor, adjusting the cuffs of his fine shirt with a deliberate languor. His brown eyes gleamed as they fixed upon Nadia, and an indolent magnetic smile drew itself upon his lips. "Well, if it isn't our formidable Nadia." Matei stepped forward, breaking the solemnity of the room with his sensual sarcasm. He leaned in too close, his tone of voice dropping to a confidential whisper that made Nadia's shoulders stiffen. "The castle missed your almost monastic rigidity, though I wonder if you came merely to weep over the ruins, or if you finally missed my provocations." Nadia turned her face away, her eyes flashing with a disdain that barely hid the open wound in her chest. The silent and intense devotion she had kept for Isolde, a deep and tragic passion that no one in the castle dared name aloud, turned Matei's presence into an unbearable affront. "Your manners remain as flighty as your character, Matei," Nadia retorted, her voice freezing. "There are things in this place that demand respect, things you are incapable of understanding." "I understand more than you think, darling," Matei teased, his eyes sliding from Nadia to Emilia with a cutting amusement, catching the electric current that suddenly connected the governess to the silent Count. "I understand, for instance, that certain presences are impossible to replace, but winter in Transylvania always finds a new way to surprise us." Lucien shot Matei a look of pure warning, but his cousin merely shrugged, immensely pleased with the friction he had caused, before walking away toward the stables. Later, alone with Emilia in the tea gallery, Nadia kept her gaze fixed on the misty horizon before delivering her first question, seeking in the governess the same danger that the quiet of that house had always sheltered. "How long did his lordship the Count say you would stay?" she inquired, with the sharp casualness of one who knows all the traps of Valdor. "We did not stipulate a time frame, Mrs. Valeanu," Emilia replied, pouring the tea with a calmness that seemed to irritate the other woman. "Ah." Nadia sketched a smile that carried no vestige of kindness, her fingers tightening around the handle of the cup with unnecessary force. "Those who stay without a time frame usually leave." Suddenly, Emilia set the porcelain teapot down, sustaining the visitor's gaze with a frigid and defiant softness. "Or they usually stay," she countered. "It depends on what they find." Nadia froze for a second too long, the cup stopped millimeters from her lips. A shadow of astonishment crossed her features as she recognized in that gentle insolence the echo of a haughtiness she had loved desperately in the past. "She used to say things like that too," Nadia murmured, her voice suddenly stripped of venom, softened by a painful memory. with that very same calmness. Before Emilia could question who the mentioned woman might be, Nadia rose and abandoned the room, leaving the aroma of jasmine and melancholy behind. Late that night, the silence of the castle was interrupted only by the intermittent howling of the wind. Emilia went down to Lucien's private study, guided by the flickering light that escaped beneath the door. Upon entering, she found him drinking, alone, an almost empty bottle of cognac upon the mahogany desk. "You do not need to watch over me," he declared, without diverting his eyes from the amber liquid in his glass. "I am not watching," Emilia lied softly, closing the door behind her. "I forgot my book." Lucien raised his face, the candlelight accentuating the fatigue in his blue eyes and the disarray of his dark hair. "You did not bring any book," he observed, his voice husky. Emilia stopped in the middle of the room. He was right. Her hands were empty, hidden in the folds of her grey shawl. "No," she admitted, taking a step forward as honesty cut through the air like a clean blade. "I did not." Lucien looked at her over his glass, the magnetism between them becoming almost unbearable in the dimness. The sensuality of the scene resided not in touches, but in the exposed vulnerability, in the glances that crossed with the silent promise of an imminent fire. "Why did you come then?" he asked, his tone dropping to a level of dangerous intimacy that made Emilia's pulse accelerate beneath the fabric of her dress. Emilia approached even closer, entering the circle of light from the desk. The smell of dark tobacco and his restrained fever enveloped her completely. "Because you look like a man who should not be alone tonight," she replied, her grey eyes locking onto his with an irresistible audacity. Lucien's glass stopped mid-air. He placed it on the table with deliberate slowness, then stood up. His imposing stature forced her to tilt her head slightly, but she did not retreat a single millimeter. The proximity was electric. She could feel the heat radiating from his body and the violent hesitation in his broad shoulders. "Do you mistake yourself often, Miss Voss?" he inquired, his voice vibrating so close that she could feel the warm breath of cognac on her lips. "Often enough to know the difference between a mistake and a necessity," she whispered, her red, hand-attractive mouth slightly parted by her short breaths, operating as a mute and dangerous invitation in the darkness of the study. Lucien's pale eyes descended to her lips, his thoughts tormented between the need to push her away and the primitive desire to touch those lips with a lascivious kiss. He did not move, but the silence that settled between the two bore the weight of an irrevocable promise, leaving the air thick and ready for the secrets the following day would bring. The snow fell in heavy, almost geometric flakes, erasing the edges of the stone buttresses and transforming the outer garden into a labyrinth of immaculate whiteness. Emilia Voss kept her hands hidden beneath her grey shawl, her breath drawing small, warm clouds in the freezing air. The silence of the valley was absolute, but in her mind echoed the words Nadia Valianu had distilled just a few hours earlier in the tea gallery, with the precision of someone wielding a scalpel. Nadia had not lied. The venom of half-truths resided precisely in the rawness of their reality. "Isolde was the son of this house, Miss Voss," she had said, her dark eyes fixed on the grey horizon. "Bright, adored by every soul that crossed these gates. And Lucien loved her with a suffocating intensity, the kind that consumes the oxygen in the room and leaves no space for the other simply to breathe." The revelation had not awakened a vulgar jealousy in Emilia, but a reflective melancholy. She processed the weight of that ghost inhabiting the dark corners of the castle and the margins of the poetry books. The sound of footsteps crushing the crust of ice behind her broke the trance. She did not need to turn around to recognize the measured, firm rhythm. The distinct aroma of dark tobacco and cedar preceded the imposing figure of the Count. "You are freezing," Lucien observed, his husky voice cutting through the quiet of the garden. "I am thinking," she replied, keeping her eyes fixed on the white line of the cliffs. "You can think inside. Inside you hear." Lucien took the final step, stopping at her side. He wore only his dark wool coat, indifferent to the biting cold that was beginning to stiffen Emilia's fingers. His blue eyes, once comparable to mountain ice, fixed on the same point of the horizon. There was a new cadence between them, a musicality made of long pauses and subtexts that dispensed with the armor of dry sarcasm. "What did Nadia tell you?" he asked directly, his jawline clenched. "That you loved your wife very much?" Emilia replied, her low voice rounding the rawness of the confession. The silence that followed was thick, laden with the memory of the burned letters in the East Wing. The wind shifted a strand of Emilia's brown hair against her face, and Lucien followed the movement with an almost imperceptible glimpse of his pale eyes. "It was true," he declared, the words coming out heavy, devoid of self-pity or artifice. "That was what she said, and it frightened me," Emilia continued, turning her face discreetly toward him. "Not the intensity. What she said the intensity cost." Lucien did not answer immediately. He continued staring into the white immensity, his knuckles clenched inside his pockets. A sweet and magnetic tension operated within that minimal distance, in the invisible warmth emanating from their bodies, despite the impending storm. The emotions remained implicit, suggested, by the rigidity of his shoulders and her absolute stillness. "I did not know how to love any other way," he confessed, his voice dropping to a whisper that the wind almost stole away. "I still do not know if there is another way." "There is," Emilia affirmed, sustaining his gaze when Lucien finally turned his head. The proximity allowed her to see the scar on his neck, bare beneath his misaligned collar. "But it requires believing that the other person is strong enough to survive you." The Count stared at her with a predatory and vulnerable intensity, a long scrutiny that seemed to strip Emilia of all her professional defenses. It was as if, for the first time since she had crossed the gates of Valdor, he saw her not as the competent governess who had come to organize his ruins, but as a force of equal magnitude. Later, the darkness of night had taken over the interior of the castle. The candles in the candelabra had been reduced to stumps of wept wax. Emilia was retiring to the servants' quarters, ascending the staircase of the south corridor, when Lucien's silhouette emerged in the dimness of one of the stone archways. They stopped a few inches apart, where the light from a single wall lamp drew elongated shadows on the floor. The magnetism that united them seemed to tension the air, making every heartbeat an audible event in the quiet of the house. Lucien opened his mouth to pronounce the usual farewell. The Miss Voss began to form upon his lips, but he stopped. Formality crumbled between them like the loose stones of the East Wing. "Good night," he said, his tone of voice completely altered, stripped of titles or social barriers. Only that. But the absence of the surname operated like a physical touch upon the skin. Emilia waited, her chest rising and falling in short breaths, feeling the growth of the timid, refined anxiety of that waiting beat. "Emilia," he pronounced in a low, drawn-out voice, as if testing the weight and texture of those syllables in his own mouth. The effect was disproportionate to the simplicity of the name. A wave of heat rushed down Emilia's spine, dissipating any vestige of the garden's cold. She understood what that concession meant. He understood it too. The rules of the house and the barrier of servitude had evaporated in the darkness of that poorly lit corridor. "Good night," she replied, her grey eyes fixed on his, sustaining the vertigo of the moment. "Lucien." It was the second time. His name, spoken by her, sounded like a promise and a silent claim. The two remained standing for a second longer than decency or prudence required, suspended in the subtext of a bond that had become definitive. The snow battered the stained glass windows of the dining room, but the true winter operated within those stone walls. The arrangement around the rosewood table broke any Victorian protocol. Lucien had demanded Emilia's presence to organize the maintenance reports that Mattei had brought, while the latter helped himself to brandy with an outrageous indolence. Mattei swirled the crystal goblet, observing the reflection of the liquid against the candlelight, before directing his magnetic gaze toward the housekeeper. "I must admit, Lucien," Mattei broke the silence, his voice drawling with his habitual seductive sarcasm. "Budapest has its charms, but none compare to the impeccable expertise of Miss Voss. Spending the afternoon discussing the administration of your ruins becomes a delight when one has such a vibrant mind at the table." Emilia raised her grey eyes from the notes, holding the nobleman's gaze with a calmness that seemed to amuse him. "The work is already completed, Mr. Dragomir," she interjected, her soft tone of voice disarming the rigidity of the room. "And I believe you merely appreciate a good conversation, just as much as I appreciate the order of the reports." At the head of the table, Lucien's hands closed over the arms of his chair, his blue eyes fixed on Emilia, a contained flame of possession and irritation inflaming his aristocratic countenance. He hated the ease with which Mattei approached her, and the slight glimpse of jealousy made his jawline contract rigidly. "Miss Voss is here to perform her duties, Mattei, not to serve as a target for your cheap attempts at gallantry," Lucien cut in, his hoarse voice falling like a block of ice. The tension was interrupted by the heavy opening of the oak doors. Nadia Valeanu entered the hall. Her eyes were red and bloodshot from recent crying, the clear marks of someone who had spent hours at Isolde's memorial, cultivating a grief that time did not dare to touch. She brought with her an aura of silent frost, but her pain came disguised as a sharp provocation upon noticing the arrangement of the table. "I see that the customs of Valdor have changed drastically in my absence, Lucien," Nadia said, her soft voice distilling a veiled cruelty as she stared at Emilia. A housekeeper sitting at the Lord's table, Isolde would never permit such a degradation of the family name. She opened her velvet purse with slow, almost ceremonial movements, and withdrew a bundle of papers tied with a faded silk ribbon. Silence settled over the table with the swiftness of a falling blade. "Since you seem so intent on rewriting the past, Lord Dragomir," Nadia continued, pushing the bundle across the polished wood until it stopped before the Count's hands, "I believe you should start with this. These are the letters that Isolde sent me during the final weeks of her life. Letters that I kept so you would never forget that the righteousness you display today was the true venom that consumed her bit by bit. I want you to feel the weight of the silence you imposed upon her." Lucien froze, staring at the angular and unmistakable handwriting of his deceased wife. His features paled, and he appeared perfectly stunned, struck at the most vulnerable point of his armor. Upon raising his eyes, he met Emilia's gaze. There was no judgment there, only a silent, deep compassion. That operated like a hook in Lucien's chest, creating a violent dilemma between the fury of wounded pride and an overwhelming attraction for this woman who managed to read his soul without him needing to utter a single word. He wanted to reject her pity, but he was incapable of ignoring how sensitive and special Emilia was. Before the Count could react, Mattei extended his long fingers and touched the tip of the silk bow, his sarcastic smile turning into something infinitely sharper, fraught with a dangerous subtext. "Ah, the letters of our beloved Isolde," Mattei commented, dismantling Nadia's martyr posture with feline precision. "Always so full of suffering. Although I wonder, dear Nadia, if your zeal in keeping these confessions stems from a servant's loyalty or from that devout affection you nurtured for the Countess, a feeling that went far beyond what etiquette considered expected of a lady's companion, a feeling that perhaps fueled the very demons that led her to her end." The refined insinuation hung in the air, suggesting that Nadia's obsession had been one of the engines that pushed the former Countess toward destruction. Nadia paled, her lips parted in a stupefied silence, disarmed by Mattei's cruel shrewdness. Emilia caught her breath, astonished by the scandalous subtext that had just been thrown onto the table. "What did you say?" The Count alternated his gaze between Nadia and Mattei with an indecipherable expression. "Ah, dear Lucien, do not tell me you never wondered why this little viper surrounded and served her former mistress so much, with a devotion that bordered on idolatry. Did you never notice the glances immersed in veiled desire that she cast upon the Countess? Please, calm yourselves." Emilia tried to intervene, placing her hand gently on Lucien's arm to restrain him upon seeing the tremor of fury in the Count's body. "You are a monster, Mattei!" Nadia hissed, her voice trembling with humiliation and contained pain. Lucien stood up abruptly, the impact of his chair against the stone floor breaking the trance of the hall. The control he so heavily flaunted crumbled completely. "Silence!" the Count commanded, his voice vibrating with a contained thunder. "Gather your things and leave this castle immediately, Nadia. You have lived here for years, and yet you seem to have no respect for the honor and the memory of this house's past. I will not allow you to spit your venom under my roof, even less so after having demonstrated such disrespect to my matrimony and hospitality while serving in this house." Nadia stood up, her eyes flashing with a desperate malice as she verbally attacked the man before her. "You never understood her, Lord Dragomir," she vociferated, tears finally overflowing. "You hide behind titles and orders, but the truth is that you were the real reason for her unhappiness. You isolated her in this tomb of ice." "Silence!" Lucien took a step forward, his blue eyes flashing with ire. You will never understand all that I gave up to try to bring dignity and peace to the woman I once loved. But it seems that you, Nadia, and my wife had secrets never revealed until now. I wonder how much your sickly devotion and your persuasive words influenced her to surrender to her own melancholy and wither away bit by bit. How dare you? She screamed, her voice shrill with anger and denial. Unlike you, I would give my life for her. I would never do anything that would lead to the ruin of my dear Isolde. And yet you seem to have an impeccable track record of destroying everything you touch wherever you go, Mrs. Velianu. Mattei finished, leaning back in his chair with a rogue elegance. His tone dropped to a dark note. Tell us the truth, Nadia. Is that not why you are here, hidden in our valley? Are you not merely fleeing the trail of ashes you left behind in Budapest, fleeing from your new cemetery of reputations? Nadia looked at Mattei with eyes filled with tears of pure hatred, her breath catching at the precise accusation. How dare you, you insolent scoundrel, she sobbed, her voice stripped of any haughtiness. Lucien took a deep breath, forcibly regaining control of the argument. The authority of his title returned to shape his imposing posture. That is enough, the Count declared, his voice frigid and final. I want you to leave immediately, Nadia. Your bags will be packed by the servants right now. I have nowhere to go in this blizzard, she protested, pointing toward the glass battered by the freezing wind. Do you want me to die on the way? That is no longer my problem, Lucien replied, without any trace of pity. You will be placed in a closed carriage to the inn in the next village. And pay close attention. Your return to Valdor is strictly forbidden. Your secrets and your presence are no longer welcome here in this castle. Nadia gathered the bundle of letters with trembling hands, casting a final look fraught with rancor at everyone at the table, before turning on her heels and abandoning the room, her quick steps echoing until they vanished down the corridor. Later, the silence that settled in the corridors was worse than the hostility of the first days. Knowing that there was something precious to be saved amid the wreckage of that night, Emilia pushed open the door to Lucien's private study. The aroma of dark tobacco and brandy dominated the freezing air of the room. He stood with his back turned, observing the mist through the glass of the high window. You knew, Emilia declared, her low voice eliminating any formal distance, cutting through the stillness like a linen blade. Lucien did not move, but his broad shoulders tensed under his dark coat. Emilia, please. Her name came out drawn out, devoid of titles. No. She took 2 steps forward, stopping at a dangerously short distance from the mahogany desk. I am not asking. I am telling you what I saw on your face. You knew something about Isolde, about what Nadia really hid behind that false devotion. You just did not want it to show before Mattei. Lucien turned slowly, the light of a single candle accentuating the shadows of his cheekbones and the irregular scar that ran down his neck. He looked exhausted, completely disarmed by the housekeeper who refused fear and insisted on seeing through his barriers. He took the final step, eliminating the space that separated them, his pale eyes fixing on Emilia's mouth with a desirous hunger that made her tremble beneath her dress. I did not know enough, he confessed, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that vibrated against her skin. The Countess closed herself off in her own world of feelings, keeping me out, without me being able to reach her torment. And that is the exact problem. The proximity was dense, a raw sensuality operating on the imminence of a touch that neither of them could avoid any longer, though the danger of that surrender hung suspended in the air. The silence of this castle is not a protection, Lucien, she murmured, her short breath mingling with his, instigating him to the limit of the truths that still needed to be spoken. It is the tomb that you keep digging for yourself. Lucien extended his hand, his long, warm fingers brushing the side of her neck with a torturous slowness that made Emilia's pulse race against her skin. The touch moved up, his thumb tracing her jawline until anchoring at the nape of her neck, pulling her subtly forward. He did not resist. Inclining his head, his lips brushed hers in a light, hungry and forbidden contact, a breath of warmth that tested the sanity of both and made the world around them disappear into the darkness of the study. The glimpse of that possession almost made him lose control, but the ghost of guilt and the fear of his own intensity spoke louder. With a hissing intake of air, Lucien pulled away abruptly, breaking the spell. His blue eyes fixed on her one last time, darkened by torment, before he turned on his heels and vanished into the night, leaving behind only the echo of his footsteps and the taste of the promise of that imminent ruin. The steel of the blades cut through the air with a dry hiss, breaking the stagnant cold of the armory. Lucien wielded the foil with an energy that bordered on brutality, his movements driven by a dull rage that he could not appease. On the other side, Dragomir parried the blows with an irritating ease, his body leaning back and his lips curled into a smile of pure disdain. Ili watched the silent duel closely, holding a linen cloth. Hand a pitcher of fresh water on the dark wood counter. His attentive gaze, however, weighed heavier on the Count than the attacks of his cousin. "You are striking the wrong ghost, Lucien," Mattei commented, deflecting a thrust with a quick twist of his wrist. "The metal will not give you the answers Nadia left floating in the hall. Save your tavern philosophy for Budapest, Mattei," Lucien retorted, his voice coming out in a rough growl. He advanced, forcing his cousin to step back. "Hand, move faster if you do not want to lose your hide." Mattei let out a loose laugh, leaping backward and lowering the tip of his weapon in a sign of voluntary truce. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, facing the Count with a rare seriousness. "You hide behind these walls and this eternal mourning as if life were an offense," Mattei said, his tone dropping to a rustic gravity. "Isolde chose her own destiny, and Nadia's shadows belong to the past. You are not to blame for the sadness that consumed Isolde, Lucien. Destiny took her. It is not your fault. It was a terrible fatality." Lucien felt a slight tremor in his hands as the words settled within his core, but his eyes clouded over as his mind tried to deny the words, clinging to his customary guilt. "Listen, Lucien. There is a rare flower in this house with grey eyes that seem to see right through that ice armor of yours. Leave what is dead buried, cousin. Open the gates before the winter consumes you entirely." Lucien drove the tip of the foil into the wooden floor, his knuckles white from his grip on the hilt. His aristocratic features hardened, and his chest rose and fell in a heavy breath. "My decisions are not open to your scrutiny," Lucien answered with a frigid coldness that made even Ili lower his head. "And what happens in this castle concerns only me. Clean the weapons, Ili. Practice is over." Without waiting for a reply, the Count threw the foil onto the oak table and abandoned the room, his firm steps echoing like a somber march. Later, the seclusion did not bring him the peace he sought. Walking through the upper gallery, Lucien's steps faltered when his gaze was drawn to the winter garden below. Through the frosted glass panels, the silhouette of Emilia Voss stood out against the vegetation dormant from the frost. She gestured softly, instructing two young maids on the arrangement of the ceramic planters. There was no rush in her gestures, only a gentle and transparent sweetness that contrasted with the usual rigidity of servitude. The way the faint afternoon light touched the brown strands escaping from her practical bun made Lucien's chest contract with a sharp pain, an unfamiliar feeling that frightened him deeply. He realized with a mixture of fury and despair that she already occupied too much space in his thoughts. The magnetism of that presence threatened to break the isolation he had sworn to protect. Irritated by his own vulnerability, he retreated into the darkness of the corridor, his teeth digging into his lower lip as he tried to stifle the desire that was beginning to inflame his veins. At the start of the evening, the east wing seemed enveloped in a sepulchral silence. Emilia was walking down the deserted corridor, inspecting the closed doors, when a gust of wind blew out the flame of her candle. She stopped, the twilight dominating the space, but the strong aroma of dark tobacco and cedar revealed that she was not alone. Lucien emerged from the shadows of a stone archway. The proximity between them was immediate, electricity stretching between their bodies in the darkness. "What are you doing here, Miss Voss?" he asked, his hoarse voice vibrating so close that Emilia felt the heat of his breath. "Watching over what you insist on abandoning," she replied, with a softness stripped of artifice, her grey eyes fixed on the blue glimpse of his pupils. "The castle is cold, Lucien, and so are you. Do not repeat my name," he hissed, taking a step forward, his imposing stature forcing her against the stone wall. The predatory tension was almost physical. He longed to pull her to himself, to silence that attractive mouth that instigated him, but the panic of causing the ruin of yet another life operated as a violent barrier in his mind. "You cross boundaries that do not belong to you," Your insolence tires me. It is not insolence, she countered, her voice soft, maintaining a calmness that only irritated him further. She extended her hand slowly, the tips of her fingers almost touching the linen of his shirt. It is compassion. You do not have to carry this guilt alone. Enough. The Count slammed the palm of his hand against the stone beside her head, his eyes flashing with a desperate cruelty. I do not want your compassion, Miss Voss. I do not want your presence, and I do not want whatever it is you imagine. This fantasy of yours of saving a broken man ends tonight. As he spoke these words, he tried to convince himself that it was a terrible idea to think about how warm and soft she would be in his arms, and how much he would desire to pull her to himself and cherish her, instead of driving her away with his cruel coldness. Emilia felt the impact of the words hit her chest, leaving her shattered. The brutal rejection tore through the sweetness she had cultivated, but her posture remained unyielding. She raised her chin, refusing to look away, though stubborn tears fought to frame her eyes. I will draft an impeccable letter of recommendation, he continued, his voice regaining a cutting and frigid formality that hurt more than a shout. You have excellent dexterity with accounts and organization. You will certainly find work at another estate far from Transylvania. Your departure will be arranged tomorrow. The silence that followed was dense, broken only by the uneven breathing of both. Emilia swallowed hard, feeling the violent pulsing of the blood in her veins. She read the subtext in his rigid shoulders. She saw the fear masquerading as disdain. As you wish, my lord, she said, the return of the title sealing the distance definitively. She walked away with slow, elegant steps, refusing to let him see her breakdown before crossing the threshold of the corridor. Distraught, Emilia climbed the spiral staircases to her simple room. The room seemed smaller under the dim light of the kerosene lamp. Her hands trembled slightly as she sat at the small wooden desk. She picked up a sheet of paper and a quill, writing quick lines to her sister, the only safe harbor left to her in the world. She folded the paper carefully and slipped it into the pocket of her grey wool coat, intending to ask Ili to mail it the following day. Looking at the corners of the room, the reality of her exile caught up with her. She had decided not to prolong that suffering. She would not beg for a place in the heart of a man who had chosen the shadows as his dwelling. Approaching the bed, she opened the worn leather suitcase on the mattress. With methodical movements, she began to fold her few dark wool dresses. With each piece she packed, the magnetism of that haunted man, the memory of the touch of his fingers on the nape of her neck, and the warmth of his breath invaded her mind with the force of a contained fire. As she closed the metal buckle of the suitcase, the barrier of her dignity faltered for an instant. Alone in the quiet of the night, Emilia allowed the first warm tears to roll freely down her cheeks, accepting the painful certainty that, even though she was leaving, a part of her soul would remain forever locked in the foundations of Castle Dragomir. The darkness that precedes the dawn was the only refuge for the torments of Lucien Dragomir. Alone in the study, with the first dull rays of the morning still far off, he watched the mist batter the high window panes. The glass of brandy remained forgotten between his fingers, the amber liquid reflecting the last dying flame of the fireplace. He had not slept. His mind wandered through a labyrinth of regrets, tormented by the ghost of the light brushing of lips, and by the weight of the cruel words he had used to try to drive the housekeeper away the previous night. The fear of surrendering to what he felt operated like a poison, keeping him trapped at the window, a prisoner in his own stone tower. A few floors above, in the silence of her quarters, Emilia Voss finished tracing the final lines on a folded sheet of paper. Her hands remained steady, though her chest rose and fell in a short breath. Without sealing the envelope, she slipped the letter into the pocket of her grey wool coat, intending to mail it as soon as she reached the first village beyond the borders of Valdor. Hours later, waiting for the Count to arrange the carriage promised at dawn, Emilia decided to take her own destiny into her hands. She picked up her worn leather suitcase and descended the spiral staircases before the first servants awoke. Crossing the inner courtyard in the deep of the night, she found the young stable boy already on his feet, finishing the cleaning of the stables. The lad, saddened by the abrupt departure of the housekeeper who had always treated him with sweetness, accepted the discreet request and readied the old carriage, knowing he would return with the coachman in the early hours of the day. Without questions, he opened the heavy gates and watched the vehicle vanish into the white immensity of Transylvania. The distant sound of iron wheels against the frozen gravel echoed all the way to the Lord's wing. Lucien awoke from a dizzy torpor, a mixture of exhaustion and the brandy consumed throughout the night. He blinked, a presentiment cutting through the remainder of his lethargy. Walking through the silent castle, the Count followed the trail of the frigid east corridor. It was near the entrance portal that a white reflection on the stone floor caught his attention. Emilia had dropped it during her hurried departure without realizing. Lucien bent down and picked up the yellowed paper. Upon unfolding it, his eyes fixed on the firm, elegant handwriting of the housekeeper. It was the letter intended for her sister. My sweet Sabina, I write to you by the light of a dying candle, nurturing the sincere hope that these lines reach your days in greater calm, and with your health restored since our last correspondence. The winter here seems to have no end, my sister, and I fear that my days at Castle Valdor have also reached their conclusion. I am departing before the sun dissolves the mist of the mountain passes. I take to the road while it is still dark for the most painful of reasons. I lack the necessary courage to look into the Count's eyes one last time. I know with a clarity that cuts through my chest that if I allowed my eyes to meet his in the light of day, my hands would falter, and I would never be able to cross those iron gates. There is an impassable abyss between us, shaped by conventions and silences that it is not my place to break. After all, who am I, Sabina, but a passing soul in the vain attempt to rescue a man like Count Dragomir from his own darkness? It is better that I go now, welcoming the harshness of his last words and the fury of his rejection as a protective shield. Perhaps if I cling to his fury, it will hurt a little less to tear him from my heart, that sacred place where I should never have allowed him to enter softly, without asking permission. I promise to send you fresh news as soon as destiny guides me to a safer harbor and a new employment. Until then, keep me in your prayers, with all the affection my soul holds. Your Emilia. The affectionate and painful words acted like a precise strike to the Count's chest, shattering the remainder of his armor. Despair, raw and violent, took the place of his pride. He ran toward the stables, his heavy steps ripping through the silence of the courtyard. Who authorized her departure? Lucien thundered upon finding the stable boy, his voice trembling with fury and panic. I am the master of this house. No one leaves Valdor without my orders. Saddle my horse immediately. The lad, frightened by the distraught countenance of his master, merely pointed with a trembling hand toward the southern road that cut through the mountain passes. Lucien mounted the dark stallion and bolted under the thin snow, defying the ice that covered the trail. The wind battered the Count's face as he urged the animal to its limit. Nearly 2 miles ahead, at a sharp bend in the pass, he sighted the dark wooden structure of the carriage. The vehicle had skidded on the ice, accumulated on the track, colliding against a barrier of rocks. One of the front wheels was completely shattered. Lucien leaped from the horse even before the animal came to a complete stop, running to the cabin. Upon pulling open the jammed door, he found Emilia trying to raise herself among the misaligned seats. There was a slight wound on the side of her forehead, where a trickle of blood contrasted with the pallidez of her skin, and she held her right hand close to her body, her wrist aching from a sprain suffered in the impact. Upon seeing the imposing silhouette of the Count appear in the opening, Emilia froze. A silent, deep dialogue established itself between the two in the quiet of the deserted road. Little was said in words at first, but the truth previously contained overflowed in Lucien's blue eyes, completely devoid of any vestige of that aristocratic arrogance that had once protected him. She noticed, in the dilation of his pupils and the tremor, that shook his long hands, that he did not wish and could not bear for her to be gone. The abyss she had mentioned in the letter seemed to crumble with every inch he advanced into the wrecked cabin. Outside, the coachman, who had suffered only a few light abrasions in the impact, was already on his feet. He was feeling his own shoulder with a low groan, but his attention soon turned to the damage of the carriage, assessing with a shake of his head the iron wheel broken against the frozen stones. His presence there became mere background noise before the magnetic silence that isolated the Count and the housekeeper. Why did you do this? Why did you depart in the dead of night, putting yourself in danger? I do not know. I think I just could not wait any longer to leave and, a light, whispered groan of pain escaped her lips, coming out tinged by the cold mist of her breath. Why did you come after me, Lord Count? Emilia fought to maintain her unyielding posture, but the dizziness and the pain in her sprained wrist made her falter against the torn upholstery. Lucien did not answer immediately. He stepped even closer, kneeling in the narrow space of the cabin. His hands, always so steady when wielding a blade, trembled visibly as he drew a fine white linen handkerchief from his pocket. With extreme, almost reverent gentleness, he brought the fabric to her forehead, dabbing the trickle of blood that insisted on staining her fair skin. The contrast of the warmth of his fingers against her frigid skin sent a shiver through Emilia's body, intensifying the electric current that had always bound them. "Because I realize that I am a coward, Emilia," he confessed, his voice dropping to a rough whisper, broken by the deepest regret. He felt her injured wrist with trembling fingers, holding it with a painful care, as if she were made of the rarest porcelain. "I was cruel and unjust to you yesterday, using my words as weapons to wound you before you could disarm what is left of me." He withdrew the folded paper from his coat pocket. "I found this on the floor of the hall. It was not sealed. I read it. I read what you wrote to your sister." Emilia caught her breath, her cheeks flushing slightly despite the cold, feeling entirely exposed before the Count's predatory and imploring gaze. "You wrote about an abyss between us," Lucien continued, bringing his face close to hers, until their foreheads almost touched, eliminating any vestige of social distance or protocol. The intensity of the moment lay not in fleshly touch, but in the absolute surrender of a man who had always preferred winter to warmth. "An abyss that I cannot cross, if the prize is your staying. Forgive me. Please forgive me. I ask that you return with me. This castle has no more life, no more music, and it can no longer survive without your presence, and I cannot either." He paused, his pale eyes fixed on Emilia's parted lips, reviving the brushing of lips from the previous night, with a contained hunger that made her tremble beneath her wool coat. "I spent the last few years pretending that loneliness was my only armor, but the truth I realize now is that I was merely waiting for someone with your gentle courage to come and break the ice. I need you in my life, Emilia. I need your spirit, your truth. I need you to learn to breathe again. Do not leave me in this tomb. Come home." To me, the transparency of that confession disarmed the housekeeper's last line of defense. The tears she had held back so much in the east wing finally rolled down, mingling with the touch of his handkerchief. She nodded slowly, allowing his gentle stability and warmth to anchor her in that moment of absolute fragility. Lucien closed his eyes for a second, letting out a sigh of relief that vibrated against her chest. With measured movements, he removed his heavy, dark wool cloak and wrapped it carefully around Emilia's shoulders, ensuring that no cutting wind would reach her. Giving quick orders for the coachman to await the assistance that Ili would send next, he lifted her into his arms with extreme ease, taking her out of the wreckage of the carriage. He settled her onto the saddle of his horse and mounted right behind, wrapping his long arms around her to hold the reins. On the way back to the castle, under the sky that was finally beginning to clear in, shades of gold and pink, Emilia remained nestled against Lucien's broad chest, receiving the warmth, the protection, and the love that the Lord of Valdor had sworn never to surrender to anyone, but which he now offered willingly to the only woman capable of saving him from himself. The hooves of the dark stallion slowed as they crossed the iron gates of Castle Valdor, whose shadows seemed less dense under the first light of morning. Lucien stopped the animal flush with the mane. Entrance, where the thin snow was beginning to give way to damp earth. With a caution bordering on adoration, he dismounted first, and extending his long arms, supported Emilia. His hands spread across her waist, lowering her from the horse with a slowness calculated not to strain her sprained wrist. "Can you walk?" he whispered against the top of her head, keeping her pressed to his chest longer than protocol would require. "Yes," Emilia replied, her soft voice still thick with exhaustion and the cold of the early morning. He did not let her go completely. Leading her with firm fingers interlaced with hers, Lucien guided her into the stone foyer. As soon as the heavy oak doors closed, isolating the biting wind of the mountain pass, the Count turned Emilia's body toward his own. There was a brief hesitation, the last remnant of his old defensive rigidity, before he pulled her into a tight embrace. Emilia nestled her face into the crook of his neck, inhaling. The familiar scent of tobacco and cedar, finding there the shelter she had tried to deny herself. Lucien pulled back just enough to tilt her chin up with his thumb. His pale gaze descended to the housekeeper's parted lips, with a hunger that no longer accepted restrictions. When their mouths met, the kiss was an overflow of truths kept in the shadows. It began with a desperate tenderness, quickly transforming into a warm and overwhelming surrender that made Emilia's knees falter. Beneath her wool dress, his fingers tangled in the brown strands breaking loose from her bun, deepening the contact, while she leaned against the nobleman's broad chest, forgetting the pain of her injury and the coldness of the outside world. "Well, well, what a fascinating spectacle to enjoy with breakfast," a drawling, melodious voice echoed from the upper balustrade. Lucien broke the kiss slowly, closing his eyes for a second to catch his breath before facing his cousin. Mate. Dragomir was descending the stone staircase with a porcelain cup in his hand, wearing a perfectly sarcastic and amused smile. "I knew the early morning commotion in the stables would yield a fine chronicle," Mate commented, his brown eyes gleaming with pure irreverence as he focused on the couple. The heroic rescue of the runaway housekeeper amidst the blizzard, the Count riding in despair. It is a scene worthy of the sugary novels the young ladies of Budapest devour in secret. "All that is missing is the glass slipper, Lucien. Go pester the demons in Klausenburg, Mate," Lucien retorted, though there was no real fury in his hoarse voice, only the contained irritation of one interrupted at the best moment. He kept his arm firmly protective around Emilia's waist. "Ah, do not be sharp, cousin. I am merely celebrating your capitulation," Mate finished with an affectionate wink at Emilia. "I see that Miss Voss has finally achieved the miracle of melting the block of ice that governs this province. If I had known all it took was a packed suitcase to make you confess your feelings, I would have helped her close them myself weeks ago." Mate's light laughter chased away the last remnants of haunting from the hall, injecting a vibrant joy that Valdor had not known for years. Time, however, took it upon itself to work its own magic. 3 months passed, and Transylvania finally shed its white shroud. Spring, in that region of the Ahr. Carpathians did not arrive with shyness. It exploded with an almost violent vivacity. The once grey mountain passes were covered in dense carpets of bluebells, violets, and wild primroses. The ice of the streams melted into a constant bubbling, and the scent of wet earth and new pines rose from the oak forests, invading the now open windows of Castle Dragomir. The estate seemed to breathe, illuminated by the golden sun that made the ancient stained glass cast vivid colors across the stone floors. This torrent of light and renewal found its peak in the darkest recesses of the property. The once forbidden East Wing, formerly condemned to abandonment, and the ashes of forgotten tragedies, had its heavy doors flung wide. Now fully open and functional, the echo of isolation had been replaced by the rustle of clean curtains and the scent of fresh flowers gathered in the valley. The spring sun flooded the once lugubrious corridors, bathing the walls with a warm vivacity, and finally relegating centuries of suffering and mourning to absolute oblivion. Valdor's stone scars had finally healed. The castle was in a flurry. Lucien and Emilia were on the eve of their wedding, a union that would defy aristocratic parlors, but which neither of them cared to justify. To complete the atmosphere of a new beginning, the gates opened that afternoon to welcome Sabina, Emilia's sister, brought at the Count's own invitation to reside in the immense castle. Sabina stepped down from the carriage with wide eyes at the imposition of the towers, clutching a wicker basket to her chest, from which an orange-furred cat with a visibly bored expression poked out. "My goodness, Emilia!" Sabina exclaimed as she embraced her sister in the foyer, her cheeks flushed from the journey. "You wrote to me that it was a castle, but you forgot to mention that your Count inhabits a fortress worthy of legends." Lucien stepped forward with his imposing posture, but his lips curved into a courteous and genuine smile as he greeted his sister-in-law. "Welcome to Valdor, Miss Sabina," the Count said, bowing slightly. "This house now belongs to you as well. I hope you find comfort in our quarters." "You are very generous, my lord," Sabina replied, offering a shy curtsy. "I only hope you do not mind Lord Amber. He is somewhat territorial." The Count wore surprise on his once austere face, looking around the carriage for the distinguished gentleman, finding no one. As if to confirm the warning, the immense copper-furred cat leaped from the basket with an agility surprising for its size, Lord Amber walked with stout, decided steps across the polished floor, stopping exactly before Lucien's leather boots, who stared down at him in stupor. The feline sat, stared at the sovereign of the castle with narrowed eyes, and emitted a sharp, demanding meow. Lucien, who had never dealt with anything smaller or less trained than war horses, arched a brow, perfectly confused. "Lord Amber is a cat." "Yes, my lord, a very peculiar cat." "What does he desire?" Lucien asked, looking to Emilia for help. "I believe he is evaluating whether you are worthy of sharing the territory, my lord." Emilia laughed, the sweetness of her laughter echoing through the hall. Before Lucien could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps announced Illy's arrival. The butler carried a silver tray with refreshments for the newcomers. Lord Amber, startled by the sudden noise or perhaps attracted by the scent of something on the tray, bolted like an orange streak exactly between the old servant's legs. "What is this? Vade retro," Illy exclaimed, trying to dodge the furry blur. The butler's balance failed by a hair. With an exasperated sound, Illy went down, arms wide, as the silver tray flew, scattering goblets and liquid across the Persian rug. Lord Amber, showing no remorse whatsoever, leaped onto a mahogany coffee table and began to lick his front paw with outrageous calm. The foyer plunged into a second of shock, until Mate's extravagant laughter, watching from the library door, infected everyone. Even Lucien, after helping the grumbling Illy to his feet, let out a low, hoarse laugh, shaking his head as he ran a hand through his hair. Valdor finally had the sound of a family. The wedding day dawned under a clear, unblemished blue sky. The ceremony, held in the castle's small stone chapel, was adorned, not with the golden ostentations of the court, but with fragrant branches of broom and wild cherry blossoms that Emilia and Sabina had gathered in the valley. Before a few witnesses, Mate, Sabina, and the oldest servants, Emilia walked toward the altar wearing an ivory silk dress, simple and of timeless elegance. When Lucien took her hand, his blue eyes no longer carried the torment of the past, but the solemn promise of a future he was ready to defend. The celebration extended until nightfall, buoyed by wines brought from the south, and the soft music that village violinists played in the torchlit courtyard. When the moon reached the top of the mountain passes, Lucien discreetly touched his wife's shoulder, leading her away from the guests without anyone noticing. They climbed the stairs toward the Lord's wing, their silent steps contrasting with the rapid beating of their hearts. Upon crossing the threshold of the bridal chamber, Lucien closed the heavy ochre door, definitively isolating the rest of the world. The room was illuminated only by the golden warmth of the embers in the fireplace. With a provocative and typically masculine slowness, the Count removed his dark frock coat, tossing it over a chair, without averting his pale eyes from Emilia for a single second. He stepped closer, his imposing stature dominating the space, closing the distance between them with the same urgency that had moved him on the frozen road. His long, warm hands rested on her shoulders, sliding slowly down his wife's back, feeling the soft tremor of her breath through the fine silk of the dress. "My Countess," he whispered, his voice dropping to the rough, thick tone that always made her pulse race. "There are no more abysses, no more silences, only you." Lucien tilted his head, brushing his nose against Emilia's temple, inhaling the scent of lavender that was now the aroma of his home. He placed a slow kiss on the curve of her neck, feeling her pulse quicken beneath his lips, a silent and vibrant response to his touch. His hands rose to frame her face, his thumbs tracing the contour of her mouth with a reverence bordering on adoration. Emilia raised her hands, touching the scar on his neck, that map of his past pains that she now soothed, before tangling her fingers in his dark hair. She pulled him toward her with a gentle but unshakable audacity, the very kind he had taught her to have during the months of confrontation and veiled desire. The kiss that followed was deep and rhythmic, charged with the accumulated magnetism of so many nights of denial, and the warmth of the promise finally fulfilled in the dim light of the room. It was not just the joining of bodies, but the fusion of two souls that had survived the winter to bloom together. Lucien wrapped her in a protective and possessive embrace, whispering words of devotion against her skin, while the shadows of the flames danced on. The walls and the world outside fell silent, for the love that had awakened, definitive and sovereign in the lands of Valdor. Summer in the Carpathians brought an opulence that almost made one forget the centuries of isolation of those mountains. The slopes of Transylvania, once buried in ice, now undulated in a vivid deep green, dappled by the gold of wild sunflowers and the sweet scent of sun-warmed hay. The air, light and luminous, ran through the passes, carrying the song of birds, and the freshness of streams descending from melted glaciers. Castle Valdor, bathed in this generous light, seemed to have awakened from a stone sleep. Its high windows were flung wide, and flowering vines climbed the grey battlements, softening the ancient fortress with the pulse of life. The echo of firm hooves against gravel announced the Count's return. Lucien Dragomir crossed the iron gates riding his dark stallion, bearing in his countenance the vigour of a long ride through the estate's forests. His aristocratic features, though still imposing, no longer carried that sombre rigidity of old. At the entrance of the main hall, Emilia awaited him. Wearing a light linen outfit that contrasted beautifully with her brown hair, pinned up casually, she held in her arms the fruit of that late spring, a little boy of only 6 months. The small heir of Valdor boasted the same light blue, attentive eyes as his father, and upon noticing the horse's approach, he broke into a toothless smile, stretching out chubby little hands in an adorable impatience. Lucien dismounted with his habitual agility, and even before cleaning the dust of the journey, stepped toward his wife. His eyes softened instantly. He leaned in to place a lingering kiss on Emilia's forehead, allowing his long fingers to lightly brush her cheek, a gesture charged with a passion that time had only matured. Then, with extreme tenderness, he lifted his son into his arms. The Count held the baby firmly and carefully, bringing him close to the stallion's muzzle. The boy let out a boisterous laugh when the animal gave a light huff, stretching out tiny fingers to touch the horse's dark coat for a few moments of pure discovery under the proud and attentive gaze of his parents. Shortly after, Lucien handed the little one to the nurse, who waited discreetly by the portals. Joining his steps to Emilia's toward the entrance stairs, Lucien wrapped his arm around his wife's, waist pulling her close to his body. "The day was productive in the valley," he commented, his hoarse, low voice resonating near her ear. "But the castle feels too vast when I am away from you." Emilia smiled, the transparent sweetness of her gaze fixed on her husband. "Then I am glad to know our quietude's days are numbered, my dear. I received a letter from Budapest this morning. Mate claims he arrives in a week to spend a long season with us." Lucien stopped on the first step, his face darkening immediately. A playful curse escaped through his teeth, but he was unable to hide the shadow of a smile that insisted on tugging at the corners of his lips. "That insolent scoundrel," grumbled the Count. "He only comes to empty my cellar and test the limits of my patience." Emilia gave his arm a disguisedly reproving squeeze, letting out a soft laugh to provoke him in the face of that feigned reaction of annoyance. "Do not be a hypocrite, Lucien. I know perfectly well that you miss his provocations. The castle feels far too silent without your cousin's irreverence, and you are the first to approve of his coming. Do not encourage him, Countess," he countered, though the glint in his blue eyes betrayed that she, as always, had deciphered his soul with precision. Before they could cross the portal, a noisy commotion from the foyer echoed out to the stairs. The sound of clinking porcelain and Ely's muffled protests were followed by a victorious meow. Lucien let out a heavy sigh, stopping again. "By the heavens, what has Lord Amber managed this time?" grumbled the Count, mentioning the immense ginger feline that now ruled the corridors. Emilia covered her mouth with her hand, laughing at her husband's exasperated expression. He likely discovered that the balls of yarn Sabina left in the sewing room make excellent prey, or, if I know Lord Amber's temperament well, he decided the top of the dining room china cabinet was the perfect place for a summer nap, knocking over half of Ely's trinkets in the process. Lucien shook his head, a low and genuine laugh escaping his chest. He pulled Emilia closer, pinning her against the dark wood portal, away from the servant's gaze. The proximity between them became immediately dense, a sensuality operating in the magnetism that bound them. He tilted her chin up, his pale eyes fixing on his wife's mouth with a devotion that time had transformed into an indestructible bond. "Let the cat destroy the china cabinet," Lucien whispered, his voice dropping to a deeply passionate and warm note. "As long as you remain here in my heart, the rest of the world can crumble." The kiss that sealed his words was slow, mature, and filled with the warmth of that summer that had finally settled in Valdor. There was no more room for fear or loneliness. Winter had passed, and in the lands of Transylvania, the story of Lucien and Emilia found its most perfect and definitive beginning. And so, dear listeners, the shadows of Castle Dragomir finally yielded to the warmth of a love that defied winter and the conventions of the age. What did you think of Lucien's redemption and Emilia's gentle courage in disarming that heart of ice? And Lord Amber's antics, do you think Ely will survive this season? Leave your comments down below. Your insight is our greatest inspiration. If you, like us, allowed yourselves to be seduced by the magnetism of Valdor and wish to continue navigating deep waters filled with contained passions, intense subtexts, and unforgettable romances, our world awaits you. Access our Patreon, My Passion Diaries, through the link in the description. Come be part of our exclusive community and discover the secrets and stories we keep especially for the most passionate hearts. You can join as a free member, or if you wish to support our work and have access to unique stories, check out our subscription plans. I am waiting for you. Until our next love story.